Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is April Wepler. I am the Engagement Coordinator at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. And our webinar today is the fourth and final in our four-part series titled Where's the Protection? Discussing the review and reform of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or CEPA. CEPA regulates a broad range of things in Canada, from the most dangerous pollutants to plastic manufactured items to genetically engineered animals. In today's webinar, we're focusing on three topics. We'll hear from presenter Heather Fast on CEPA and vulnerable communities. Meg Sears will talk to us about electromagnetic frequency, and Mark Butler will talk about biotechnology. If you missed it, the first three webinars in the series are available on CELA's website on the same event page where you registered for today's webinar. And before we get going on our webinar, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. So today I'm in Guelph on the banks of the Speed River, which is the traditional lands of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Six Nations of the Grand Watershed. And I'll start off by telling you a little bit about CELA. As many of you are aware, we are a specialty legal clinic within the Ontario-wide network of clinics funded by Legal Aid Ontario. We work to protect human health and our environment by seeking justice for those harmed by pollution and working to change policies to prevent such problems in the first place. As a legal aid clinic, our top priority is to represent low-income individuals and communities and to speak up for those with less influence and who receive less of a say in decision-making. And we're pleased today to be co-hosting our session with Nature Canada, one of the oldest national nature conservation charities in Canada. For 80 years, Nature Canada has helped protect over 110 million acres of parks and wildlife areas in Canada and countless species. Today, Nature Canada represents a network of over 100,000 members and supporters, and more than 800 nature organizations. Nature Canada is engaging in the modernization of CEPA in order to protect the genetic integrity of wild species and ecosystems, and to ensure that Indigenous peoples' rights are respected. Quick bit of Zoom housekeeping reminders to please keep your microphones muted during the session so we don't have any issues with background noise. We are recording today's session, and we'll share that link back out with everyone after the webinar, as well as the slide decks. So those will get emailed out to everyone, and they'll also be posted on our website, on CELA's website. Should you have any questions during the session, please feel free to put those in the chat box at any time. You may see occasionally presenters responding to those questions in the chat box throughout the webinar, but we'll also make sure to address them during the Q&A at the end of the webinar. And we'd also love it if you would introduce yourselves in the chat box, and you're welcome to share a land acknowledgement if you'd like. So on the line with us today, we have some folks from CELA, including myself. We also have researcher and paralegal Faye De Leon, counsel Joe Castrilli, and our current articling student Zoe St. Pierre. From Nature Canada, we have Mark Butler, senior advisor and lead on this work for Nature Canada, and Hugh Benavides, advisor to Nature Canada on CEPA reform. And you'll likely hear from many of those folks in the discussion period at the end of the webinar. And for our speakers today, as I mentioned, we're pleased to welcome Heather Fast, Meg Sears, and Mark Butler. And I'll be introducing each of our speakers just before they present. And so for those who are old hat at our webinars, you'll be familiar with the polls that I'm going to do really quickly to get a sense of who's on the line. So if I could just get everyone to answer this poll question about what sector you represent, what field you're working in. It's really helpful to us in having a sense of who's on the line. Great, so I'm going to leave that up for just a couple more seconds. Okay, and we'll share that back so that you can see really high proportion of NGOs on the line today, and also lots in the other box. So feel free to let me know what sector you represent in the chat box if you'd like. Then the next question we're going to ask, I know we're talking across Canada today, so if you know your drainage basin, you can let us know where in the country you are. We also have other, in case you're from further afield or unsure. High school geography was a long time ago, that's okay. All right, we'll give this just a few more seconds. And as always, if you're in that other category, would love to know in the chat box where you are. Okay, and we'll just share this back with folks so you can see where people on the call are from today. And then our last question, this is always helpful for our speakers to get a sense of the level of knowledge that people on the call have. And we're all very Canadian here and like to just say we're somewhat knowledgeable about this broad and complex topic. I'll just leave this up for a couple more seconds. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'll just share that back. Lots of people being honest that they don't know a whole lot about CEPA, which is fair. It's a big topic. Okay, so without further ado, Zoe, we can pull down the welcome slide, and our first presenter today is Heather. So Heather, if you want to go ahead and share your slides while I introduce you. Heather Fast is a policy advocacy director with the Manitoba Eco Network. Prior to joining the staff, Heather was a member of the board of Manitoba Eco Network. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba's Natural Resources Institute and teaches environmental law at the Faculty of Law. She was called to the bar in 2014. Heather will share her perspectives on the importance of Bill S5 and vulnerable populations. So with that, I will pass the mic over to Heather.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here today and appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar. So as April already said, my name is Heather Fast, and today I'm here in my capacity as the Manitoba Eco Network's Policy Advocacy Director. I'm speaking with you today from Treaty 1, the territory of the Cree, Anishinaabe, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis peoples. It's also important to acknowledge that the water I drink comes from Territory 3, and the power I use comes from Treaty 5 territory and beyond. The Manitoba Eco Network is a public interest environmental organization that seeks to promote and facilitate good environmental governance and the protection of Manitoba's environment for the benefit of current and future generations. A small research team from the Eco Network, led by my brilliant colleague, Alexandra Caporelli, has been working on a community-led research project over the last year that I'm here to talk about today, called the Healthy Environment, Healthy Neighborhood Project. Through this project, we grew to better understand the importance of legal reform at all levels of governance, and have been using the insights we've gained from our project participants to engage in discussions about CEPA and Bill S5 at the federal level. So we've had many wonderful contributors to this project, which was funded by the Manitoba Research Alliance and the Manitoba Law Foundation. You can find them all listed at the end of this presentation, and we greatly appreciate all of their contributions. So in the Healthy Neighborhood, or Healthy Environment, Healthy Neighborhood project, we focused on gathering insights from residents of inner city and mature neighborhoods in Winnipeg who live or work near industrial sites and zones. Many of our participants are long-term residents of their areas in the process of raising children and grandchildren and have close community connections. A mix of different people live in these areas, although as you move towards the center of the city, there tends to be higher proportions of low-income individuals, Indigenous peoples, and people of color. No matter where our participants lived, though, one commonality was concerns about and experiences with a broad range of environmental and health impacts they linked to nearby industrial activities, and the feeling that government didn't care. Thus, many people in our study area could be considered part of a vulnerable population. We sought answers to a range of different questions focused on gaining insight into community concerns and identifying possible legal and policy solutions to improve citizen access to environmental justice. Although this is just the preliminary list, as you can see, our project participants identified a broad range of concerns they linked to historic and ongoing industrial operations in their communities. This includes a range of toxic contamination, noise pollution, dangerous and scary situations resulting in explosions, metal shrapnel, and fires, lots of concerns about health impacts, and in particular emphasis on mental health impacts. Many of our participants expressed a sense of futility. They felt like no matter what they had done, government and industry just wasn't going to listen to their concerns about health and environmental impacts. Overall, participants suggested that current policy and legal approaches need to be reevaluated and reformed to better address community needs. So part of the commitment we made to our project participants was to undertake advocacy activities that advance the concerns of community members. As a result, the ECO Network has been participating in the parliamentary process for Bill S5 and advocating for changes to CEPA that could better empower Manitobans and improve their access to environmental justice. So this slide is titled Talking About CEPA, but in many ways, our journey to engage with community members, public interest organizations, and a range of different political representatives from both the provincial and federal levels has resulted in our project team actually learning a lot more about CEPA and its potential to help address some of the access to justice needs of our community members. With every new webinar I've attended, Senate committee meeting I've watched, or Hansard transcript I've read, and there have been many of them at this point, we continue to identify new approaches with the potential to help Manitobans. And I will say that I am definitely solidly in that middle category of CEPA knowledge, so I may defer some more technical questions to those on the call who know more. So why does a small little organization in a jurisdiction that usually gets skipped over care about what's happening at the federal level? One of the main questions we've been asked when we've been engaging with different people, particularly those who live outside of Manitoba, is, isn't this something your provincial and municipal government should be dealing with? And the answer is yes. But as many of our project participants have told us, they aren't doing a very good job. Manitobans don't have recognized environmental rights. There's a lack of opportunity for meaningful public involvement in environmental governance processes. There's gaps in available information. There's a history of weak environmental enforcement and a lack of public legal standing to engage in various political and legal processes. So Manitobans are at a disadvantage and looking for help from anyone who's able to help us, even if it seems like a very insignificant way. We need the federal government to help fill regulatory gaps, provide funding for data collection and access to justice work, and ensure Manitobans enjoy the same environmental rights as Canadians in other jurisdictions. So what have we been focusing on? We've been talking and learning about CEPA and Bill S5 to try and improve the opportunities for Manitobans. So we've been really interested in the increased protections for vulnerable populations proposed in Bill S5. Many of our project participants could be considered vulnerable due to their proximity to industrial activities and exposure to negative health and environmental impacts. There's also a need to address the disproportionate level of impacts experienced by certain communities and acknowledgement of the systemic racism that often plays a role in creating this situation. Financial and legal supports are also desperately needed to assist community-based actions in vulnerable communities. Since Manitobans don't have recognized environmental rights at the provincial level, we're also very excited about the recognition of the right to a healthy environment at the federal level. In particular, we've been interested in potential improvements when it comes to enforcement, for example, giving us more legal standing. We, of course, have also been very interested in potential stricter regulation of toxic, persistent, and bioaccumulative substances, and have been seeking stricter regulation of industrial activities that result in release of toxic substances. For example, many of our project participants have been struggling in particular with metal shredders, which seem to fall into a bit of a legal gap between federal and provincial regulation. And of course, we're also looking for stronger enforcement of current legal provisions at all levels. One of the surprising things we learned from our participants was that in order to improve access to environmental justice in Manitoba, is that there's a need to improve access to environmental and health data, including information about cumulative effects. So to ensure available information about industrial operations and negative impacts is considered credible and can be relied on by community members, many participants have emphasized the need for more independent testing opportunities, ideally funded by government. Similarly, many participants felt transparency and legitimacy of monitoring, testing, and investigation processes would also be improved if community members were given a direct role in the process. We also were hoping that the federal government could help with the development of missing environmental standards. In particular, we have a lack of air quality standards in Manitoba. So I've just discussed all the things that we were hoping to get out of Bill S5 and a reformed CEPA, but are we actually going to get these things? Unfortunately, it seems like no. There are still gaps and improvements that could be made to Bill S5. And I will definitely say that to reach this conclusion, we've very much benefited from the knowledge of other groups who've taken the lead on legal analysis and proposing changes, like everyone involved in organizing these webinars and all of the wonderful speakers that have spoke at previous, and as we will hear in this webinar as well. Our community members are nervous about the proposed changes to Schedule 1. In particular, there's concerns that removing the toxic title from some substances will make it harder to get government and industry to take community concerns seriously. We're also unsure if removing the ability to create pollution hotspots regulations is helpful. To us, it seems like a mechanism that could be used to help Manitobans. We would still like to see better consideration of cumulative effects and stronger regulation of harmful industrial activities. We're also disappointed in the way that the recognition of the right to a healthy environment is proposed in S5, since it's not going to help Manitobans anytime soon. There's a need for recognition and implementation as soon as possible, so citizens can better protect themselves from actions that threaten their health and surrounding environment. We also need to address concerns with the balancing factors and critiques of Section 22 of CEPA. Changes definitely need to be made to make this section functional. We've seen some improvements in terms of access to data potentially, but we are hoping for more in terms of creating opportunities for community members to collect and assess information. And once again, it's very important to see mechanisms that allow for independent and funded testing opportunities. Overall, taking a community-based approach to the Healthy Environment, Healthy Neighborhood project and letting community members guide our understanding of their access to justice needs has been an incredibly valuable experience and has helped the Eco Network advance our advocacy skills and gained a lot more experience at the federal level. We've also learned a lot about CEPA and the wonderful organizations doing the hard work of engaging at the federal level. You will not find more deserving clients and colleagues than the people trying to protect their friends, family, and homes from negative environmental and health impacts, no matter where they live. So it's important to keep advocating and pushing for legal changes at all levels that will help improve the lives of impacted community members and the lives of future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was so well said. Thank you. All right, at this time, our next speaker is going to be Meg Sears. So Meg, if you want to go ahead and get your slides up while I introduce you. With Prevent Cancer Now, Meg Sears champions healthy, sustainable choices by individuals and on behalf of the public by governments. Choices based on rigorous science via laws, policy, and regulation. At the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, she focuses on information and methods to link environmental exposures to health.
Thank you ever so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to join you today with Prevent Cancer Now. We believe that wireless radiation is possibly a very important missing link in biodiversity loss, and it's an adverse exposure for everybody. Could I have the next slide, please? And so we've added a cell tower to the advert for our series of webinars. Next, please. Like a lot of what Prevent Cancer Now does, this is a case of contested carcinogenicity. Health Canada says that this radiofrequency radiation does not cause cancer. The International Agency for Research on Cancer says it possibly causes cancer, but with intervening research, radiofrequency radiation is now a high priority to reassess. And in the meantime, independent doctors, epidemiologists, and scientists have been doing that reassessment and say that radiofrequency is a human carcinogen. Next, please. However, there's very little attention from the regulatory point of view on environmental effects. And in 2021, there was a series of publications that are landmark, that are really changing the conversation on this. It is a 3-part review of over 1,000 studies. They find that due to their unique physiologies, some species of flora and fauna are sensitive to exogenous or anthropogenic, that's man-made electromagnetic fields in ways that may surpass human reactivity, and that biological effects have been seen broadly across all taxa and frequencies at vanishing low intensities that are well within the range of today's ambient exposures. Next, please. And these wildlife effects include orientation and migration, food finding, reproduction, mating, nest and den building, territorial maintenance, longevity and survivorship, and also cyto, that's cell, and genotoxic effects. So wildlife loss is often unseen and documented, they say, until tipping points are reached. And this is what the international community is telling us. So it's time to recognize that ambient electromagnetic fields are a novel form of pollution and develop rules at regulatory agencies that designate them as air habitat. So EMF can be regulated like other pollutants. And this is the these are the words of Levitt et al., these researchers, world-renowned biologists. Could I have the next slide, please? So Prevent Cancer Now and our good friends at Canadians for Safe Technology, we put together a report in support of including radiofrequency radiation within CEPA. The ask is not a lot. It's basically to open our eyes. We think that this agent should be added to Section 44 for data collection and for research. Could I have the next slide, please? And just to situate you on this, this is the electromagnetic spectrum. So at the far right-hand side is ionizing radiation like X-rays that will knock an electron off an atom. Moving to the left, there's ultraviolet, and then there's that very narrow window of light that we can actually see. Then down at the tail end of infrared, we're getting into the microwaves and the radio waves. And those are the frequencies that are used for telecommunications. They're not plain waves, they're pulsed. They have special characteristics because they are carrying information. Next, please. And these are going up a lot. It's tremendous, the amount of radiation that's increasing. So this was published in 2018. It refers to previous data. If you look carefully at the little ticks down the along the sides, they are increasing, not 1, 2, 3, but 10, 1,000, 1,000, 100, a million, a billion, etc. So historically, the green was our exposures. The atmosphere intercepts a lot of what we're seeing in the red zone, which is the new radiofrequency radiation that has just increased since 2010. With 5G and so on, we're now up to those wavy lines at the top, which are exposure limits for people. And it's bulging off to the right because these new frequencies are being added. Have the next one, please. Canada is called Safety Code 6, which is the standards for human exposure. We have nothing for wildlife. The only thing it considers is whether or not tissue is overheated. The science is incomplete, it's not systematic, it's out of date. But despite this, and we have a procedural problem as well, because we found out that Health Canada had doubled the exposure limit for 5G frequencies, and there was no consultation, and we got the scientific report. There was no substantive evidence of safety either. So to summarize, there are no non-thermal effects at lower frequencies, or sorry, at lower exposures, lower power. These are complex signals, and they also can synergize with chemicals. So if you're exposed to the radio frequency radiation, it can make toxins more potent. Next slide, please. And for the environment, the frogs don't use cell phones, but the emissions from these towers have very uneven distributions. There are lobes, and then there's the main beams. And you can see that right under the tower, it might not be as strong an exposure as it is a bit further away. Next, please. So as I say, the human exposures are only for people who stay on the ground and outside of the fence, but lots of creatures don't stay on the ground and outside the fence. Next slide, please. And who might be in that antenna main beam? There are a lot of towers that are actually proposed nearby and in natural areas because the neighbors here don't complain. Next, please. And so if we want to look at some of the effects of this radio frequency radiation, one of the really interesting things that they're realizing now is that there's cryptochrome. Cryptochrome is in all creatures. It's in our eyes, it's in insects' eyes, and it's in birds and as well. It is a light sensing chemical, but it also is used for detection of the Earth's magnetic field. And radio frequency radiation interferes with cryptochrome, and it interferes with the detection of these magnetic fields that are central for migration and for orientation for bees to figure out how to get back to that really good flower that they were at before. On the right-hand side, we see results from one experiment. There are many of these that on the right-hand side, there's a circle in the direction that birds take off after being exposed. And so after being exposed, they take off in every which direction because they can't figure out which way is north or south. But on the left, the birds that were not exposed all took off in basically the right direction for their migration. Next, please. So electromagnetic radiation, particularly radio frequencies, is also an emerging driving factor for the decline of insects. And I'm sure that most of the people online have heard a lot about how insect populations are crashing. They're essential. And so some of the documented effects for insects are effects on foraging and feeding, navigation, fecundity, how many eggs they lay, how successful reproduction is, pollution, and for bees, whether they can collect enough food for the feeding of their larvae. And these effects are seen with power lines, phones, Wi-Fi, and towers. In phones and Wi-Fi when in experimental situations. These effects are on the immune and the nervous and the reproductive systems. Next, please. So this is just an example of a couple of papers looking at how when the towers were put up, there were changes in the abundance and the diversity and the richness of insect populations. One was done in Nigeria, and one was done on 2 separate islands in the Mediterranean. And they both found very important impacts on the populations of insects. The ones that didn't, okay, sorry. It was interesting that in the second study, the insects that lived underground were not affected as much. And in fact, they increased a little bit, which may have been because of the reduced competition, because the other ones that lived, that had nests and so on above ground, were declining. Next, please. And as we move to higher and higher frequencies, to more complex telecommunications, some researchers looked at the absorption of the power of for different insects. And so here we see that as the frequency increases and it goes through a wavelength that is the same wavelength as the insect, that the signal, instead of going, some of it at least, going through the insect, it's resonating within the insect. The power all stays within it, and so they absorb more. And this means that some frequencies are more dangerous to some of the insects than others. On the right-hand side in this study, they looked at the power absorbed at different frequencies across the bottom by different honeybees and the beetle, and they were similar, but the locust, which is bigger, actually absorbed more. So it's not a one-size-fits all in terms of risks from this kind of radiation. Next, please. Radiofrequency radiation injures trees. This is a recent large study, a long time, a timeline kind of study that was, as they say, revisiting a study from 1986. And they basically found that trees in the line of sight of these cell towers or radio towers were more likely to suffer decline. The leaves would brown, the leaves would fall off, and eventually the tree would die. But since these waves are, at least to some extent, intercepted by buildings, that buildings actually protected them. So the line of sight was important for predicting this decline. Next, please. And this is an example from one large study on tree damage caused by mobile phone stations. And they did a long time series, and they have many, many examples in this paper, but this is one pair of photographs from that study. And just over 2 years' time, the tree that was most exposed thinned, and then it died. Obviously, the cell tower was to the left. Next, please. So this makes us really wonder, with 5G, we have huge intensification of the infrastructure. So we're now putting many mini cell towers all along streets. So what is this going to mean? Next, please. Just to summarize the biological effects, this is from the white paper and that we produced, and it's online. So there were problems even at the very lowest exposures that are 2,000 times lower than what is permitted. We've got effects on birds and insects, mammals, plants, and ticks. Next, please. So what's missing in Canada? Environmental protection against radiofrequency radiation. This was presented to not HESA, it's the ENVI study on CEPA. The government then committed to that they would look at this. And then in we never saw the evidence that Environment and Climate Change Canada looked at it. So in 2021, in response to a petition to the Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development, they confirmed that they had not examined the environmental evidence and that they had no plan to do so. Next, please.
Meg, I'll just let you know you have about 2 minutes left.
Thanks. We're getting close. In the US, the same thing is true. And the US, so our friends at Environmental Health Trust, they took the US Federal Communications Commission to court, and in a lot of other petitioners joined in. Eventually, the court ruled, went up through courts. The court ruled that the FCC completely failed even to acknowledge, let alone respond to concerns regarding radiofrequency radiation on the environment. Next, please. And this is a duplicate, I apologize. Next, please. Fortunately, there are very good alternatives. Wired infrastructure is better for the future, and the wireless are more complex and costly and unstable and constrained. So not only we have an alternative that is environmentally better and in the long term, a much better business case. Next, please. So we hope that this will not be another late lesson from early warnings, and that at least the Government of Canada will open its eyes to this issue. Next, please. So thank you very much. And special thanks to Canadians for Safe Technology, the Environmental Health Trust, and certainly the Canadian Environmental Law Association and Nature Canada for sponsoring this. I welcome questions.
Thanks very much, Meg. Appreciate that. So any questions for Meg, you can pop those into the chat box and we'll take them in the Q&A portion of the webinar. And this is a good time to remind everyone that we are scheduled to go until 2:15. So no need to panic if we get close to 2 o'clock. We do have an hour and 15 minutes together. Okay, at this point, Zoe, can I ask you to put Mark's slides up while I introduce Mark? Mark is a senior advisor with Nature Canada. He is working to ensure that the rapidly developing field of biotechnology does not have unintended and negative consequences for nature. He is also working with Indigenous peoples organizations and governments to ensure Indigenous peoples' rights are respected. Mark was Marine Coordinator and subsequently Policy Director with the Ecology Action Centre in Nova Scotia for 23 years. In those roles, he helped build the organization into an effective voice for conservation and sustainable prosperity. Previous to EAC, Mark worked as a marine educator, a fisheries consultant both in Canada and overseas, and as a deckhand on commercial fishing boats. He has undergraduate and graduate degrees in environmental studies. Mark likes to grow food, catch fish, watch birds, and spend time with his children in Mi'kma'ki. Mark, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, April, and hi, everybody. And first, I just want to say thanks to all the presenters over these 4 sessions and to the audience who has joined us. And I also want to do a special shout out to Zoe Saint-Pierre, Faye de Lyon, and April Wepler, and to Sila for co-hosting this with Nature Canada, and to all the work they put into this, and April for your excellent moderation of these sessions. And I'm also happy to say that our timing is pretty good. Bill S5, which is the bill to, which is amending CEPA, was in the Senate in the spring, and now it's in the House of Commons, and it will go to committee very soon. So if you want to have some influence over what's in this act to amend CEPA, now is the time. In my presentation today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got here, why I'm talking about genetically engineered organisms, and then link that back to CEPA. So if I could have the next slide, that would be great. Start my timer. Okay, as you might have guessed from the title of this presentation, Nature Canada's primary concern is with the genetic pollution that GE organisms can cause when they interbreed with their wild counterparts, or another term for it would be a genetic introgression. It's similar to the impacts that invasive species can have when introduced into a new environment, except that here you could actually have the species interbreeding and the genes from the engineered species moving into the wild population. Also, as April mentioned, many of the species, in particular Atlantic salmon and other salmon species, are of great cultural and importance to Indigenous peoples. So there's an intersection with Indigenous peoples' rights. And the question of consent comes up, and also the use of Indigenous knowledge in assessments. Next slide, please. Genetic engineering is a big, complex, complicated, sprawling topic. It raises when you're altering, modifying the code of life or the code of a species, it raises many concerns. I'm not really going to address them here, but certainly I am very cognizant of them. Next slide, please. So as April mentioned, I'm in Shabuttuk, which is Halifax. I live in Nova Scotia. I'm living in the land in Mi'kma'ki. And for many years, I worked with the Ecology Action Center. And for a number of years, I heard about this US company, AquaBounty, that was developing a genetically engineered salmon. I had a lot on my plate, so I didn't pay a lot of attention. But as the company began to ramp up its operations, I began to pay more attention. And also folks like Lucy Charat with CBAN said, hey, as an environmental organization prominent in the region, you should pay more attention. And as I looked into it, I became concerned about what is the risk to wild salmon, to wild Atlantic salmon. And also was cognizant that this was the first genetically engineered food animal in the world, and perhaps the first that was likely to end up on store shelves and plates of Canadians. So as we know, precedents are important, both good and bad, and you need to pay attention. So Ecology Action Center got involved. Next slide. And just a little background. There are still commercial fisheries for wild salmon, for Pacific salmon on the West Coast. But if you see salmon in stores, if you buy salmon, you're buying Atlantic salmon, Salmo salar. And if you see cages in the water, be it in Nova Scotia or BC or Chile or Norway, and it's salmon, then it's Atlantic salmon. Next slide. But we tend to forget that salmon is a wild animal. It's a wild species. It's found in rivers from New Hampshire to Russia. It spawns in freshwater, matures in salt. It's very much part of the ecosystem. Next slide. This beautiful salmon river in the Gaspé. Next slide. And unfortunately, Atlantic Canada doesn't support a commercial fishery anymore, but there is still an important recreational fishery and an Indigenous food fishery. Next slide. And like so many species on planet Earth, Atlantic salmon is in trouble. This map just shows you the number of populations that have some kind of conservation status under COSIWIC. Next slide, please. So back to AquaBounty. AquaBounty took genetic material from two other species, a species called ocean pout, which is a marine species, and a West Coast salmon, a Chinook salmon, to create their genetically engineered salmon. Next slide, please. The purpose of that alteration, which began at Memorial University, was to create a fish which would grow faster and consume less feed. And now this is the picture that you usually see with any story about aquabounty salmon. And even if the story is a negative one, this picture usually appears, and it kind of bugs me because really it's probably good advertising for aquabounty, but I also think it's not accurate. It's the growth rate. From what I can tell, there's very few independent studies of the growth rate of the growth rate claims by aquabounty. And in talking to experts in the field, from what I can tell, probably now with non-GE selectively bred Atlantic salmon, you're probably getting comparable growth rates. So, you know, we dispute the claims of aquabounty around faster growth rates. Next slide, please. So the company has got approval under CEPA to commercially produce a genetically engineered Atlantic salmon in Prince Edward Island. Now, as you can see, this is a land-based operation, which is a good thing, which creates a barrier between the salmon and the wild. And there are some other measures in place to prevent fish escaping. But our concern is that over time, if this fish becomes the fish of choice in the industry, both in Atlantic Canada and perhaps in the US and elsewhere in Europe, you know, you're talking about hundreds of millions of fish being raised in numerous facilities, and the probability of escape starts to approach 100%. And we already have fish escaping from open net pen and ending up in rivers as far away as Greenland. And when these fish, and they're non-GE fish, they're not genetically engineered fish, when they breed with wild salmon, they reduce the fitness of the salmon populations in specific rivers. And again, our concern would be with genetically engineered fish escaping and breeding with wild salmon. They would be introducing these non-salmon genes into the wild population and reducing the overall fitness of the population. And I should mention that, you know, another thing we're concerned about, not just around the laws of probability, but also is that there's going to be regulatory slippage. When this facility in PEI was first approved, it was only allowed to, it was only growing genetically engineered salmon, but they are now growing a non-GE salmon too. So the risk of a mistake being made and GE salmon being shipped instead of non-GE salmon increases. Next slide, please. And in case you're wondering, yes, this salmon is, it's now, we believe, the company says they're producing it. It's now in stores in Canada, perhaps in restaurants and sushi bars. But since Canada doesn't have any labeling requirements, you wouldn't know whether you were eating it or not. So if you had salmon last night, you might have had GE salmon. Next slide, please. And aquaculture is where we're seeing a lot of talk about genetic engineering. This is a picture of a mussel trout, a rainbow trout. The one in the foreground is the engineered species to have more muscle, therefore more flesh, more attractive potentially to growers. The one in the back is a non-engineered trout. As far as I know, it's not in commercial production, but there is lots of talk about engineering lobster, shrimp, bream, all kinds of species that are grown for human consumption. Next slide. For example, in Japan, they've recently approved a bream, which is a marine species. And all the species I just rhymed off there have wild counterparts, so our concern remains. Next slide. And we're also seeing aquarium fish being altered to make them more attractive to aquarists. There's a company called Glowfish, which has engineered a number of species of aquarium fish to glow under black light. And all these species would have wild counterparts. Next slide. And I'm sad to say, this year in the spring, scientists in Brazil documented the first case of a transgenic fish reproducing in the wild. Now, luckily, this species was not native to Brazil, so it doesn't look like it's interbreeding with wild populations, but I can guarantee you, given the rate of escapes of aquarium fish, that sooner or later that's going to happen either in South America or Asia, where many of these fish are from. Next slide, please. So to take us back to the Aqua Advantage salmon, which is the name AquaBounty has given their salmon, when myself and the Ecology Action Center heard about this fish and looked at the way in which it was approved under CEPA, we thought there was inadequate consideration given to the risks and to protecting wild salmon. So we launched a court challenge. Unfortunately, we lost, we appealed, we lost. So that made us think, hey, the law itself needs modernizing and updating. Next slide, please. So let me give you a quick, a very short history of living organisms in CEPA, which is a term that's used to describe both genetically engineered and other organisms used by industry. The Act was first passed in 1988, and it included both chemicals and eminent substances, as they called them back then. But then in 1999, they pulled out the living organisms and put them in their own part 6. In 2017, there was the Act was meant to be reviewed every 5 years, but finally in 2017, the House of Commons Environment Committee reviewed the Act, and I myself and others presented to the committee at that time. And coming out of that review, they recommended a full review of the regulatory regime for genetically engineered organisms, plus some specific changes to the Act itself. The government responded to the committee's report. They offered some voluntary consultation, note the word voluntary, plus not much receptivity to full review. Instead, they proposed some administrative changes. Fast forward to 2021, C28 was introduced. This was an act to amend CEPA. It contained only minor changes to Part 6. And in conversations with the department, which we were having at the time, they said they would do a review of the regulations, but no changes were required to the Act in their view. Then an election was called, C28 died, moved to 2022. S5 was introduced in February of this year. Again, same thing. It was basically a mirror version of C28. And again, in conversations with the department, they said, hey, we don't need to make changes to the Act, but we will do this review at some point. Thankfully, the senators thought otherwise, and senators, when it went through the Senate earlier this year in the spring, they made some amendments to Part 6. Thank you, Senate. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's now in the House of Commons, and will soon go to committee where further amendments can be made if MPs and their parties can be convinced to make those changes. So finally, after 22 years, or at least 10 years, if you want to take it back to 2017, just this past week, or last week, Environment Canada announced that they're going to start a review of the regulations that govern genetically engineered organisms. So interesting timing. we can discuss that perhaps in the Q&A. Next slide. So we have a number of recommendations, and some of them around transparency, some of them around rights of Indigenous people. And we're also raising the question of need, which I think comes up when you're talking about aquarium fish. Next slide. And here's our kind of, I don't know how you'd call it, a summing up of our approach. We think it's if we start to use more of these species, the probability of them breeding with their wild counterparts will only increase. Governments, most of us agree that what we should be doing is halting and reversing biodiversity loss, not introducing new stressors. We've seen what's happening with chemicals, so let's learn from that experience. And one more slide to say thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to April.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mark. That was great. All right, Zoe, if you want to put our closing slide up. So I am seeing some questions coming into the chat box. I'm going to be mindful to not read people's names as I'm reading their questions aloud, since we are recording and not everyone necessarily wants to volunteer to have their name recorded for posterity. As I'm scrolling through, I'm also noting a really lovely comment that someone has chosen to share kind of their personal stories with EMF. I won't read all of that out, but I would encourage you to read that through in the chat. Thank you for sharing that. So I'll just, before we get into questions, say thank you very much to Heather and Meg and Mark for those very informative presentations. And thank you as the facilitator for being timely. So the first question that I saw in here that I will read to the panel, and please feel free, panelists, to put your cameras back on if you'd like to, and you're welcome to also unmute your microphones if you don't have a lot of background noise. So the question that we'll start with says, it seems to me that CEPA defines pollution as substances, but gene pool pollution and electromagnetic pollution are not substances. Is the fix simply a change in the CEPA definition of pollution? And then it goes on to talk a little bit about some calls to the DFO around anthropogenic noise. But I think the question there is the fix simply a change in the CEPA definition of pollution? And so maybe I'll pose that to Mark first and then see if Meg wants to add something. And then if any of the other panelists would like to weigh in.
Well, I think probably what I'll do is to flip it to Hugh. I mean, there is no discussion about whether genetically engineered organisms belong in CEPA or not. They clearly do, and they are regulated by CEPA, but it's how they're regulated. Now, when it comes to EMF, that's another question that maybe Meg can answer, but we might have to bring a lawyer in too.
Yeah.
Hugh, oh, go ahead, Meg.
Oh, sorry, go to Hugh.
Hugh, did you want to add something to Mark's comment there?
Only that I was madly trying to make sure I'm right, but I don't think pollution is, maybe Heather can help. I don't think pollution is defined in CEPA, so without a definition, and we would just take the common sense definition. But with substance, well, in answer to Joshua, a living organism is a substance because the definition of substance is extremely wide. And there's been a debate that I won't rehash or enter into here in the Senate that electromagnetic pollution was not a substance, and that's a battle of the scientists. But it seems to me that the side that argued that electromagnetic pollution or radiation was composed of substances was a pretty strong argument. So I won't say more than that, except, and then finally, Josh also mentions noise as pollution. And I think back to CELA used to have, I think they're still available, its very earliest submissions and documents it produced posted on the website. And I recall from that and from talking to early CELA people that noise pollution was one of the early forms of pollution that really occupied the time and concern of the early CEPA people, urban pollution. And we've kind of forgotten that noise is a classical and relevant and important form of pollution. And we've kind of ignored that it's doing damage to all of us, including marine animals. That's all I'll say there.
Okay, thanks, Hugh. And Meg, did you want to weigh in as well?
Certainly. We see in the scientific literature that radiofrequency radiation is commonly referred to as a pollutant. During the discussions in the Senate committee, the government representatives, basically the bureaucrats, they were saying that CEPA only deals with substances, which, you know, given the concentration on the chemicals management plan and so on, that kind of makes sense. But it's not defined as such in the law, I understand. And if you're a physicist, then, and you get down into the wave particle duality, and there actually is some mass to energy and so on, in a rather esoteric level, certainly it could be considered a substance. Nevertheless, it interacts with the effects of substances. In children, if you consider the amount of time they put a cell phone to their head and their blood lead levels, then the ones with higher exposure to radio frequency radiation and the higher levels of blood lead are more likely to have attention deficit disorder. Whereas, and this is like thousands of kids were studied in Korea for this, whereas the ones simply with higher blood lead or higher phone use were indistinguishable, but together. And this has been seen in vitro, in lab studies, and in animal carcinogenicity studies. So there's no doubt that radiofrequency radiation potentiates the effects of known, you know, what we already consider to be pollutants. And so basically in the Senate, to answer Joe's question, in the Senate, Senator Patterson proposed the amendments that we had suggested, and they were voted down, partly because of the applicability of this substance issue. And then the other argument that was put forward was, well, there's other laws that deal with this, but in fact, there aren't. There's no other law that will collect data and do research, which is all that we were asking for in CEPA. And there's no other law that deals with environmental effects. Every law pertaining to radiofrequency radiation refers back to Safety Code 6, which is very clearly limited to humans. And as I said, the science behind Safety Code 6 is very deficient. So that's, I hope that kind of covers off the various angles there.
Mm-hmm. And just in case anyone's not reading the chat or following the many things that are coming into the chat. So Meg also answered Joe Castrilli's question there, and I'm comfortable reading Joe's name. That was, can you discuss how amendments to address EMF during Senate hearings on Bill S5 were dealt with? So Meg also answered that question in her response. And I'll add, Hugh also noted in the text that by way of further support of Meg's comments, air pollution is defined in CEPA, but pollution is not. All right, scrolling through questions. There are lots. Trying to have any of, or I'm just wondering if any of the panelists are reading questions, if there's one you particularly want to make sure that we get to. I'm seeing one here around the biotechnology question a bit more, so maybe I'll read that one. Canada has not adopted the Cartagena, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, protocol on biosafety to the Convention on Biological Diversity. If you're familiar with it, how helpful would it be if Canada adopted the protocol? That is a question for Mark, not to put you on the spot, Mark, because I don't know if you're familiar with that protocol.
Not especially, but I think it would help, would be the short answer. It'd be interested to hear from anybody else. Hugh, even Joshua himself. Sounds like maybe Joshua could help us on this one himself.
So I'll invite the asker of that question, if you wanted to unmute and weigh in for a brief moment about it, you're welcome to do that.
Well, no, that's Joshua. No, that's the reason why I asked the question, because I don't know the answer. But I do know that Canada is hosting the Convention on Biodiversity in December, and I'm wondering if there's any groups that would be raising this about electromagnetic pollution effects on wildlife, and maybe putting Canada on the spot on the international stage.
There are some discussions about doing that, exactly that. Thanks a lot, Joshua. You can help.
And I have must say I've neglected COP because I felt it was more important to focus on CEPA, but I agree it's an important entry point. And I know people like Lucy Charette with the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network is more familiar with the international laws and treaties, conventions. So I should check with her. Yeah. Thanks, Joshua.
Thanks very much, Mark. So I'm going to break protocol and ask a question of my own that arose out of some of these comments here. And it's a question for Heather. And Heather, I apologize if you mentioned this, but I'm wondering about kind of this intersection around effects of EMFs and vulnerable populations and people who are living near these sorts of places. So is that something you heard in the conversations you were having with folks in the communities as part of your study?
I can't speak to that directly, as the results are still coming forward and my colleague Alexandra is working diligently on getting that information out. But I do know that we heard about a surprising amount of different potential impacts, some that we weren't even expecting to hear about. So I would say this is an issue that's definitely been discussed in Winnipeg, particularly in kind of a downtown context. So I can't tell you for sure if we heard about it. You'll have to check out our final report next month and see, but I would definitely not be surprised if there were some people bringing up this issue, because we've heard community concerns in the past about this.
Mm-hmm. So likely it's another layer on top of all of the layers that you were hearing about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Could I add one brief thing on this? I'm working with Prevent Cancer now, obviously, but I've been interested in environmental health for a very long time, and I wrote a report for the Canadian Human Rights Commission on environmental sensitivities. So people have been calling me up because one day, all of a sudden, they just couldn't get out of bed. They had brain fog, they had pain, they had pounding headaches, they were very disabled, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. They managed to get themselves, out to work or something, and they found that they felt a lot better in some environments than others. And eventually they tracked it down and realized that the day they couldn't get out of bed was the day after 5G had been activated, and the radio frequency radiation in their neighborhoods had gone up a lot. And I've had many calls about this. So it's actually a real thing. And it's something which there's no way for people even to report that. But doctors are saying that as well. So a lot of the time, people just don't even make the connection.
Right. Sorry if I look distracted, it's because I'm going back and forth trying to drop some good links into the chat box. So this is, I know we're at 2:13, and I know we still have questions in the chat box, which is part of why I'm dropping these links into the chat, because I want everyone to have at least the websites for the various organizations who have presented today. And I'll just reassure everyone, we're going to take the slide decks, and we're also going to take all the links that you can see on this slide that's on the screen. I know you can't click on those. You may be very creative and able to cut and paste it somehow, but we shared some of those in the chat, and we will be sharing all of those to all of you via email, and they'll also be on the CELA website. So not to worry if you're not getting all of those links down quickly, those will be shared back with you. So I would encourage anyone whose questions that we didn't get to reach out to any of our speakers, to connect with them, to talk those pieces through. Yeah, so many comments going back and forth. This is great. I'm going to feel awful shutting down the chat box at 2:15 because there are such great conversations happening, but I would encourage us to continue those beyond the webinar today.
Could I just answer one more question? April O'Donoghue asked about ultraviolet light being addressed in CEPA. It is indirectly, in that ozone depleting substances are mentioned in the are scheduled in CEPA, and the only reason that they are there is because they affect the ultraviolet light. And so really indirectly, we already have not radio frequency, but a very close ultraviolet light is indirectly regulated under CEPA.
Okay, thank you, Meg. So at this point, I will ask if Mark, Hugh, or Heather have any very quick last comments, or Faye, sorry, Faye, I can't see you on my immediate screen, and I know we've lost Joe. So if any of our speakers or staff have any last comments before we wrap up.
I think my final comments are, like, we can tell that these are complex issues, but they do deserve to be dealt with under CEPA, and we hope that the next phase of the CEPA review on Bill S5 will open up conversations to accommodate those discussions. But I do want to thank the fantastic presentations by Heather, Mark, and Meg on today's webinar. And it really closes off an opportunity for people outside of CELA and Nature Canada to learn more about CEPA and Bill S5, and I hope this will generate interest to approach the committee that's responsible for dealing with Bill S5 in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you, Faye. That's great. Seeing a thumbs up from Mark, nods from Heather. All right. Well, with that, I will just repeat Faye's thanks to everyone who spoke on the webinar, who helped organize it, who helped run the tech, and to everyone in the audience for taking the time to participate in the conversation today. And you can watch your inboxes for a follow-up from us. Thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.